and welcome to another episode of the Bible in a Year podcast, which is a resource from Enter the Bible. Journey with us through the books of the Bible, discovering more about Scripture and how it shapes our lives today. I'm Katie Langston.
And I'm Kathryn Schifferdecker.
And today we are delighted to have as our special guest on the podcast the Reverend Dr. Brad Kelle. Brad is a professor of Old Testament and Hebrew and the Associate Dean for Graduate, Non-Degree, and Accelerated Undergraduate programs in the Reuben Welsh School of Theology and Christian Ministry at Point Loma Nazarene University in San Diego. How'd I do? Did I get all the names in there right?
I need a longer title. I don't know what it's
I don't think it's nearly long enough.
Ridiculous.
I would agree with that. Ask them to tag on a few other things, you know?
No.
Brad is well published and kind of tries to alternate between pieces written for the academy and those written for the church and other general audiences, with a focus on trauma, moral injury, violence, and biblical interpretation, especially the Old Testament prophets and Israelite history. His most recent work involves the Book of Hosea, with a forthcoming commentary on Hosea in the Old Testament Library series published by Westminster John Knox, as well as a new book on Israelite history entitled A Student's Guide to the History of Israel and Judah, published by Erdmans. So wonderful, lots of expertise here, and that's very helpful because we are going to be talking about the Book of Hosea. Welcome, Brad. So glad you're with us.
Thanks. It's really delightful to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So let's start with just kind of a quick summary or outline of the Book of Hosea, if you would, Brad.
Yeah, the Book of Hosea presents itself as a collection of messages from the prophet Hosea, who is presented as living and speaking among the people of Israel kind of in the second half of the 8th century BCE in the northern kingdom of Israel. Fun fact, he's the only one of the prophets who is listed as being from the north, who's also speaking to the north of the northern kingdom. You might remember Amos is also speaking to the north, but from the south, according to the book. So Hosea a little bit unique in that way, I think. But the book itself kind of divides into at least 2, but maybe 3 noticeable sections: chapters 1 to 3, chapters 4 through 11, and chapters 12 to 14. And they're each marked by different things. Chapters 1 to 3 is dominated by this marriage and family imagery and metaphor. It's the part of the book that most people know. If they know anything about the Book of Hosea, they've seen that, or they've seen movies, and some really dreadful movies and other things that have come out around that book.
Okay, I'm curious. I don't know.
Yeah, should we name names like that? I don't know.
Yeah, I think we should. What movies?
Redeeming Love. Stay away. Okay. But
Okay.
anyway, chapters 1 to 3, chapters 4 through 11 is more what you think of when you read the prophets, a lot of prophetic messages, or what we call oracles, but heavy reliance on metaphors in there. And then chapters 12 to 14, similar messages, but also a mixing of what you might call historical retrospectives from Israel's past. So references to things like the traditions of the Exodus, or the Jacob story, things like that. So the book itself, each of those 3 parts kind of has, you can see a movement from judgment to hope throughout each of those parts, and then across the book as a whole. The one thing that you will notice content-wise, the book is dominated by metaphors and images, and some of those are really beautiful, and some of the images are really troubling images of violence, and especially related to women, gender, sexuality. So you encounter a lot of that when you come to this book and its basic contents, because of how it communicates, especially through metaphors and images.
Sorry to derail, but to go back to what you were saying, so Redeeming Love, what is that?
Redeeming Love began as a novel, and became a major motion picture that was released in theaters maybe 2 years ago now.
Okay.
I can't remember, but it's one in a long trend. We can pick on that one because it's the most recent and the most big budget.
Mm-hmm.
But as we were saying, readers throughout history, and I mean that literally throughout history, have been fascinated by the stories of Hosea's marriage and family life that are somewhat depicted in chapters 1 to 3, depending on how you read those chapters. But this is spawned off into all kinds of kind of adaptations of this into novels and movies and things like that are often kind of romanticizing what you see there, but turning it into kind of what is recognizable as a modern love story.
Okay.
Or something. A lot of questions about whether or not that's what you're actually reading in chapters 1 to 3, but that's the spinoff of it. And Redeeming Love was the latest, greatest of those, which actually set it in a Western context. So it was cowboys and so lots of.
So they're taking these kind of problematic texts and then trying to kind of romanticize them in a way and be like, you should marry a prostitute and redeem her.
Well, it's really interesting what happens with the character of Gomer in these reception into these things. So a study worthwhile doing sometime there as well.
Okay, very good. All right. Sorry for the derailing. So
that's okay.
What is the basic context of the book? Like, when was it written? Who's the original audience? Do we know?
Yeah, I think this is really important because it helps avoid some of those pitfalls that sometimes have happened in the history of interpretation of this book as people have read it. So if you look at the way the book presents itself, obviously there's lots of conversations to have about origins and compositions of these books, but the book presents itself as being set in the northern kingdom of Israel in the second half of the 8th century, so the second half of the 700s BCE. And probably what is most significant about that is this is the time of the rise and the emergence of the Assyrian Empire. And it's beginning especially its impact on the area around where Israel and Judah was. This was a time of sort of rising Assyrian imperialism. And that's what's happening across the 50 years or so that make up the back half of the 8th century, the time in which this book is presented. So even though a lot of effort and time and ink has been spent on trying to do like a biography of Hosea, so what's going on with him and this marriage and whatever, that's actually not what the book is doing. The book is more set against what is happening in Israel in light of this kind of emerging Assyrian imperialism and the effects that imperialism is having on the people in terms of their self-understanding of who they are as a people, and also their practices. What is it that they think they need to do to survive, to have provision, to have protection, to do all that? And that means religious practices certainly are at play and mentioned in the book, but more than that, social practices, economic practices, and especially in Hosea's case, political practices. Hosea spends a lot of time, addressing Israel's rulers, leaders, kings, the power brokers, if you will, the ones who are making decisions, I think, on the basis of this encroaching and increasing imperialism that they're having as a kind of a vassal kingdom to this rising Assyrian empire. How do we survive in that? And Hosea, I think, has a particular vision of who the people of Israel are supposed to be, even in the midst of these pressures of imperialism and survival and all of that stuff. And for him, it's grounded in this idea of devotion or faithfulness, which I think is how the whole marriage imagery comes in at the beginning. But this idea that the people are supposed to have this exclusive devotion to God that is grounded in the Exodus for Hosea. Everything goes back to this sort of Exodus identity where God is like, I rescued you, yes, but I brought you into this unique, exclusive kind of relationship. And so Hosea seems to be pretty convinced that the way that the people, but especially the rulers, are reacting to the threat and the pressures of rising imperialism and survival and all of that is really kind of moving them away from this identity of having this exclusive devotion to Yahweh grounded in the Exodus that then has all these spillouts into what does that mean for the practices and the life of the people religiously, politically, socially, economically. It's having all those effects. So I actually think if we can avoid kind of reading the book as some sort of biography or something of this guy who has this unusual marriage, see a lot more of what's at stake here, which is ultimately the question of not just who is God, but who are you as the people of God, and how do you live in the world, especially under these moments of threat, imperialism, survival, when things are at stake in those moments.
So we have danced around it a little bit, and I think it would be helpful to just, for the listener or viewer, just kind of describe what's happening in those first few chapters. I think that would ground folks who maybe aren't familiar.
Sure. Yeah. Again, these are usually the parts of the book that anyone knows if they know anything about
Sure.
Hosea. Maybe a reference to, because there's some that are quoted in the New Testament, so you pick up a little bit of that. But yeah, chapters 1 to 3 they're not of a piece. First of all, we should say that. But what dominates it is this imagery of Hosea's marriage and family, where Hosea, and again, the text is a lot less clear in the details than it has been made out to be. So you mentioned the colloquial idea that Hosea marries a prostitute. That could be, but that's not as clear in the text as we have sort of read it in that way. But regardless, Hosea receives this symbolic act instruction by God to marry a woman who is described as, and again, the translation is difficult here, a woman of fornication or whoredom or prostitution or something, like something untoward, basically. A woman who lacks this kind of devotion for one reason or another. So marries this woman, has children with this woman, and this becomes a metaphor for the way that Israel's own relationship with God is marked by this kind of inability to be loyal, faithful, devoted. And there is in that a lot of metaphor and imagery that has to do with a portrayal of the woman's actions and a lot of threats and things like that come into what to do, what ultimately ending with a kind of reconciliation, almost remarriage imagery, kind of near the end of that. But the language is really slippery. Chapter 1 is very clearly sort of about Hosea and Gomer, but chapter 2, it all kind of morphs into a metaphor where it's not so much about these two humans anymore, but the woman is a metaphor for either Israel or perhaps the rulers, depending on how you start. So it becomes a larger metaphor, basically, of a broken marriage, a broken social body, a broken relationship marked by unfaithfulness, disloyalty, that then in the end receives this kind of reconciliation that's initiated by God and this restoration kind of a thing. So that's kind of what unfolds. It's very interesting. It's unfortunate. We mentioned there are 14 chapters. It's unfortunate because most people only know that story and not the details from chapters 1 to 3. But also that never carries through to the rest of the book. I mean, that is its own entity in chapters 1 to 3. And chapters 4 to 14 are doing, other things that are more related to what we were talking about a moment ago.
Thank you. That's helpful.
And actually the metaphor shifts, right? Later to be not husband and wife, but father and child.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing about Hosea. Like, entering the Bible, and to use your podcast, entering Hosea, it's about metaphor. Like, you have to kind of get in your mind that, yes, there's other stuff going on, but the primary way this book is communicating stuff is through metaphor, and it's metaphors plural, as you just said.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's, the metaphors are sometimes, it's a vast diversity of metaphors, sometimes paradoxically aligned, like they don't even make sense together. And the realms they draw from are really wide. So there are metaphors that come, like chapters 1 to 3, from the realm of marriage. There are other familial metaphors, like you're mentioning the one that's in chapter 11, which is a parent-child metaphor for God and Israel. But the range of metaphors branches out to wildlife, animals, agriculture, baking. I mean, there's all kinds of stuff in there.
I love a good biblical baking metaphor.
Well, then you like Hosea. Hosea's one is safer than Ezekiel's baking metaphor. If you know, you know. So
that
check
is
it
true.
out.
That is
right. Okay. If you know, you know. And,
I'm not cool enough to know.
Yeah, Hosea's is better. Not great, but better. So yeah, but I think that's the way to think. Like, you got to get your mind around metaphors, because that's the way this book does communicate its messages.
That's really helpful, because my next question was, what's a way into the book? So it sounds, especially given 8th century BCE, in a land far, far away, time and place, right? A way into the book for modern readers. It sounds like being open to that kind of metaphorical, imaginary language.
I think the two things I would add to that would just be to say, I think the other way into this book, and this goes off of the context piece, is to think trauma.
Mm.
That this is a book that is, I think, reflective of not so much individual trauma, but communal trauma, the kind of trauma that happens to a community that raises questions about its identity, its understanding, its practices, can really kind of tear apart its social body, which I think is what we're seeing in that metaphor of a broken family in chapters 1 to 3. And so here's this trauma of this emerging Assyrian imperialism and all the, not just violence, but the stuff that goes with that, that's social, economic, relational, what are we going to do to survive? So if you're thinking, is Hosea somewhat of a response to the trauma of emerging imperialism that's bearing down on the people and possibly changing their identity and tearing their social body apart? That's what you're reading, I think, in the book. And I think what's driving Hosea is Hosea doesn't like the response that is being given by those in power about provision, protection, survival, what they're doing, maneuvers, political, social, religious practices. He has a different view on how that should, and it's one that ties around that Exodus identity of the people, and then has. So I would say enter it by thinking about metaphor, but in the context of that trauma, and then kind of pushing yourself to say, this isn't a book that's just about religious life. I think that's the other way a lot of people read the book of Hosea. That's just about, make sure you worship, Yahweh and not Baal or whatever. Religious element is part of it, but this is a book that is really about, especially in chapters 4 and following, not just religious life, but political, social, and economic life. What does it mean to be God's people, or to be God's Exodus people, in that context?
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, it is now time for our favorite part of the episode. We are going to play a wonderful game called Bible Bingo. And this is where you have sent us 5 concepts, words, people, places, context, whatever, that would be on your bingo card as you read through this book of the Bible. And so we'll do a rapid, I like to call it rapid-ish fire kind of movement through these. So the first is metaphor.
Yeah, I feel like I gave my whole bingo card away already.
Yeah,
in this
sorry.
Like, I really have already hit on the metaphor. What we already said.
There's metaphor in there. Very good. I love it.
All right.
Marriage and family.
Yeah. So here I'm thinking of chapters 1 to 3, but also the way that family metaphors show up in the rest of the book. This is a key for reading the book of Hosea. And I think the reason it matters is it ties into that idea of devotion, faithfulness, loyalty. What does that look like? Well, a good metaphor for it, I guess, could be a marriage or a parent-child relationship or something like that. So I think you see that. But the other thing it does in the book is it raises the emotional. When you talk about the relationship between God and the people in terms of this, broken marriage or something, all of a sudden it's drawing you in a new way to the significance, but also kind of the power of what's at stake in these kind of things. So watch out for marriage and family. However, some of it is tough for us as contemporary readers, and we have to sort of work through that and be cautious with that as well, especially the gender portrayals there.
When I teach Hosea to my students here, I talk about those family relationships, the metaphors, right, of husband, wife, and parent-child, and they can be dangerous and are to some extent in Hosea for reasons we've already talked about. But as you just said, they're also really powerful, and that's why Hosea uses them, right? Like some of the closest, probably the closest relationships that most of us will know in life are spousal and parent-child. So for that reason, they're powerful metaphors.
Yeah, agreed.
Can I ask, it sounds to me, Brad, like you're maybe a little bit, agnostic or on the fence about how literally to read the story of Hosea and Gomer. Is that fair to say?
I think what I would say is, well, as with almost everything, we have nothing to go on outside of what this book tells us. So if you want to have an argument about whether or not this happened or something literally, I mean, that's fine, but I don't know what basis you're going to have the argument on. I mean, it's there. And so, but I think the point of it, though, is the reason I like to push people away from that reading a little bit is that kind of biographical reading has sort of overwhelmed the book of Hosea, so that it has become about this dude and how, oh my gosh, he put up with this really promiscuous wife, and isn't he great, and isn't she terrible, and the whole thing. And the problem with that is not only are we completely at a loss to reconstruct any kind of biographical stuff, although that has not stopped us from trying, and that's not just in popular culture, that's in academia as well, but runs the risk of missing the point of the metaphors themselves in chapters 1 to 3 and the book as a whole. And focusing on sort of Hosea as a person or the man, or what was Gomer? Like, what does it mean that she was a woman of fornicate? What does that mean? By focusing on that, you're missing the point. Like, for example, in chapter 1, the real message of chapter 1 is actually not the marriage. It's the names of the children. The names of these kids that are these wildly weirdo names that are symbolic names for judgment in all this way. So you run the risk of missing what's actually going on when you start focusing on this kind of biographical stuff. And again, the Bible doesn't make for great movies like on its own, so we have to help it. And then we sort of get now all of a sudden Hosea is a Western cowboy who runs a ranch, and she's the city girl who worked at the brothel, and now, so there's a lot. Right?
It's giving a Pretty Woman a little bit, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. I mean, Pretty Woman, you can see a similar vibe. I mean, I don't know if we just dated ourselves really hard right there.
No, because it's like because everyone, because we're cool and we like vintage. It's not because we're old.
That's it.
All right. Exodus.
Yeah, I think this is the key tradition in which Hosea grounds his messaging about what it means to be the people of God, or who Israel is in this moment. And again, it goes back to that idea of exclusive devotion. We have been called into this particular relationship with God through God's grace in the Exodus. And so you will see several points in the book where Hosea keeps coming back to the whole matrix of Exodus. And I think it's because there's a struggle going on about who are we and how do we live as God's people in this moment in the world. And so you see that, I think, playing out over and over again as an attempt to give an identity-forming narrative, which if you know anything about communal trauma, that's one of the things that often gets fragmented, shattered. So I think this is an attempt to give that kind of identity-forming narrative into the midst of the situation. So watch out for the Exodus language all through the book in various ways.
Cool. Politics. I didn't know there were politics in the Bible.
Yeah, a lot of them. And I think what I mean here is what we've already talked about, which is to bear in mind that the book of Hosea is often read as just being about religious life, but there's no such dividing of these realms as most people know, I think, in the Bible, but certainly not in Hosea. And Hosea understands religion, politics, social, and I think what he means, particularly in the book, by politics, is the maneuvers, the machinations that are going on among Israel's rulers and leaders to secure what they believe to be their own survival, their provision, their protection. So things like alliance and rebellions and all, and certainly the kind of militarization of things, these kind of, so there's a lot of that. In fact, there's probably more of that than there is of just straight up religious focus in the book of Hosea. But it's a good reminder that all of that is entwined in Hosea's vision.
And then finally, we have divine love.
Yeah, so this is the one I think you land on. Hosea is often referred to as the prophet of love and all that. I think that largely comes out of the marriage metaphor stuff. But the other piece is you really get in the book of Hosea a fascinating glimpse of this portrayal of God's character or God's nature as overwhelmingly driven by love and faithfulness. All the things that Hosea thinks Israel is not doing are embodied in God. And so the overall movement of the book, you kind of get early on this message from Hosea about there seems to be this real problem with the people, almost a character flaw, like an inner flaw. It's what Hosea calls the spirit of fornication, the Ruach Zanunim, which is, I think, should be the name of a band or something, because that sounds awesome. But like this, awesome. There's this promiscuous impulse, you might translate it, that is in other words, there's a character flaw, there's a problem in the people. They just can't be loyal. And so what's going to happen with this? And so it kind of reaches its climax in a way in chapter 11, where we get this really interesting, matched very few other places in the Old Testament, glimpse into sort of the inner heart and emotions of God, which is this picture of God's basically being overwhelmed by God's love and compassion and saying, I should let you go, but I just can't do it. Like that's just not who I am. And then out of that flows, by the time you get to the end of the book, this message, not just of restoration, but transformation. So the book ends with God actually saying, I will heal you of your unfaithfulness. Like, in other words, I will heal you of this inner problem, this character flaw, this whatever, that's keeping you from being loyal. My promise is I will do this transformation, but not because of anything with you, but solely because it is motivated by the character of God. God is loving in a way that not only won't let go, but then will do something to make a new and different future possible. But all that only, the people's only hope for a different future is the character and the nature of God. It has nothing to do with their own things that they do or something. So there's this, all through the thing is this contrast, but this emphasis on, I think in a way that we just don't see quite just everywhere else, this deep-seated kind of love and compassion that comes out of the character of God. This is just who God is.
Wonderful. That was amazing. Thank you so much for playing Bible Bingo. Pick up your prize at the door on your way out.
No, thanks, Brad. I love that description of divine love. That is really beautiful. So we've talked about a number of chapters and passages in the book, particularly chapters 1 and 2. Are there others, just briefly, that we haven't mentioned that you would want people to be sure to look at?
Yeah,
as they read
I think
Hosea?
there's two categories. I think one is there are passages here and there that people will recognize and that can be more significant when you put them in their context in the book. So one of the famous passages is Hosea 6:6, which also gets quoted in the New Testament, which is where God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. I desire steadfast love and the knowledge of God, not burnt offerings, kind of thing. Which is powerful on its own, but if you look at it in the matrix of what's going on in Hosea, and ironically, that comes right on the end of a passage that's talking about a rebellion and a war that the leaders have sort of gotten themselves into. So very interesting to think about this call toward steadfast love and the knowledge or the acknowledgement of God, both long-term loyalty kind of things rather than short-term actions for survival or something. So that's one. But I think if you want to follow the movement of the book as a whole and you take it as it comes to you, noticing in chapter 4, following on the, kind of presentation of the broken unfaithfulness problem in chapters 1 to 3 in a metaphor, chapter 4 is where you get the language of this spirit of fornication, this promiscuous impulse, this character flaw laid out. And then not too many, you get some of the, as you go through, you see the problems with that. And then pretty quickly you get to chapter 11, which is where you see the big turn in the book based on what we just said about this picture of the character of God as love. And then if you go forward, I think you land especially in chapter 14, which is the ending promise of the book, which is where you see that language of God saying, I will heal you of your faithlessness or your unfaithfulness, whatever, however you want to say it. And it issues out of that sense of the love of God. And then there's the metaphor of this beautiful kind of new future. And it's an agricultural metaphor with the kind of trees and plants and fruitfulness and all that. So that you can see, I think, from chapters 1 to 3, but especially 4 and then 11 and 14, this kind of movement of the book from the problem, the inner flaw, to the resolution, which it turns out is in the inner being of God's own character, to then the outworking of that with a promise of not just restoration, but actual character transformation that will make a new future possible.
I love that. That's a beautiful arc. And I love not just restoration, but transformation. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you for that.
Yeah. Besides bad theological love stories, how has this book been important for Christian life and theology?
Yeah, I think we kind of said it. But I mean, I think of three things. This is a book that's really honest about the human condition, this propensity to sort of turn away, but not to turn away in a sort of rebellious way, but to turn away out of a fear for our own provision and protection. Like we need to do something to make sure we survive, especially in traumatic times. So we are going to look to other sources for provision and protection or whatever. So this is a book that's really, it kind of highlights that problem of the human condition, but then, like I said, matches it with this really heavy emphasis on the character of God as love that issues forward into this promise of transformation. I just think the book of Hosea is interesting because if you read it against that setting, it helps us think about what is it like to live as the people of God in a kind of response to traumatic times, events, pressures, fears, survivals. What does that do to religious practices, social practices, economic practices, political practices? Unfortunately, none of that is relevant for any of our world at the time we are recording this.
Not at all.
But maybe someday, thinking about what it means to be God's people in the matrix of those pressures, I think that's what the book of Hosea sort of invites you into.
Yeah. Thank you.
That's beautiful. You probably have already answered this too, but what's one key theme you'd want people to look for as they enter the book of Hosea? Is it that divine love?
I think that works. I would maybe pull it out a little bit from that and say just ask maybe three questions when you read the book. Who is God in this book? Like what is not in terms of like who's God and who's not God, but like what is God like?
Yeah.
Be ready.
What kind of God is this?
A bit of a bumpy ride, and I think it gets to a good place. It doesn't necessarily always feel that good. So be ready. That's a bumpy ride. But I think that's the first one. Like, what does this book say about who God is? But then the second one is, who are we as God's people? What does this book say about that? What does that look like? And the third piece comes right out of that, which is how then should we live in the world? Like in light of who God is and who we are as God's people, what are our practices? What are our ways in all these different realms? So I do think if you can kind of go in with those three questions in mind, who is God, who are the people of God, and how are the people of God supposed to live in the world, especially in facing times of trauma or fears for survival, you're going to have a lot to work with in the book of Hosea. But it will help answer, I think, some of those questions in some really interesting ways.
Those are three great questions for any book of the Bible.
I agree.
That's a great way to enter the Bible.
Yeah. I mean, I always say if you were supposed to lead Bible study and you forgot and you show up, you just read the passage and then say, I have three questions for us to discuss. Who is God? Who are the people of God? There we go. All
That's
done.
good. That's good.
That's good.
I love it.
That's good.
I love it. Well, thank you so much. Always our final question here, kind of a fun one, is describe this book in 7 words or less.
Okay. Let's say divine love. Let's say human faithfulness / unfaithfulness. That struggle.
I'm going to let that slide.
Trauma with fear for survival thrown in there. No, don't count those. That's only 3. And
we're
then,
not counting.
And then
I was counting, but
transformation.
Perfect.
We'll go those 4.
Good.
Is that good?
That was amazing.
That's great.
That was so
amazing.
hard to do.
That is hard to do.
We're not mathematicians.
No.
Thank you so much, Brad. You've really opened the book of Hosea, and I know that our listeners will dive in with interest and curiosity into the book. So thank you so much for that.
I hope so. This is great.
All right. Well, and thank you to our listeners and viewers. This has been the Bible in a Year podcast from Enter the Bible. Check out more great resources at enterthebible.org. Whether you're listening on your favorite podcast app or watching on YouTube, we appreciate your following along with us in these episodes of the Bible in a Year. You can get more great resources like this, conversations, reflections, commentaries, anything you could need as you dive in and enter the Bible with curiosity and faith. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review or like and subscribe. And of course, as always, the very best compliment you can pay us is to share this podcast with a friend. Until next time.